Footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as a 7-year-old girl approached a house most grown men avoided. Inside sat a notorious Hell's Angel, oblivious to the folded piece of paper sliding into his rusty mailbox. It was a warning he ignored for 3 days. On day 4, everything changed. Thomas Hayes was not a man who expected good news in the mail. Known on the streets and within the deeply guarded Brotherhood of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club as Grinder, he was a 48-year-old veteran of the Vallejo Charter in Northern California. Grinder had spent 25 years wearing the famed red and white. His leather cut bore the iconic death head patch on the back, flanked by the top rocker reading Hellas Ains and the bottom rocker proudly displaying Vallejo on his chest. The coveted 1% diamond patch served as a stark reminder to outsiders he lived by a different set of rules. His house sat at the end of a quiet, dead-end street. It was a modest, single-story ranch heavily fortified with chain-link fencing, blackout curtains, and a state-of-the-art security camera system. The neighborhood knew better than to complain about the deafening roar of his custom Harley-Davidson Road King at 2 in the morning. They also knew to keep a wide berth from the towering, heavily tattooed man whose history was woven into the gritty, violent fabric of California's most infamous biker wars. The Grinder, the battered, rust-eaten mailbox at the edge of his driveway, was nothing more than a receptacle for utility bills, junk mail, and the occasional court summons. He rarely checked it, and when he did, it was with a sneer of profound irritation. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon when the first note arrived. 7-year-old Lily Harrison lived 3 blocks away. She was a quiet, painfully thin girl who usually spent her afternoons riding a rusted tricycle up and down her own driveway, keeping her head down. But on this Tuesday, Lily was far from home. Her small hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled, sweat-stained piece of wide-ruled notebook paper. She kept looking over her shoulder, her wide, terrified eyes scanning the street for a specific, dark-colored sedan that had been haunting her neighborhood for weeks. Approaching Grinder's house felt like walking into the mouth of a dragon. The massive skull and wings insignia painted on the side of Grinder's garage seemed to glare down at her. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of classic rock echoing from inside the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Holding her breath, Lily darted forward, shoved the folded piece of paper through the rusted slot of the mailbox, and ran away as fast as her small legs could carry her. An hour later, Grinder stepped out onto his front porch. He was built like a cinder block, his arms covered in faded prison ink and freshly minted club tattoos. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the heavy afternoon air, and walked down the driveway to retrieve the mail. He pulled out a catalog for motorcycle parts, a final notice from the electric company, and a small, hastily folded square of lined paper. Grinder paused, his heady brow furrowing. He flipped the paper over. There was no stamp, no address, just the word "Please" scrawled on the outside in shaky, uneven pencil. For a brief second, curiosity flickered in the biker's cold eyes, but his mind was heavily occupied. The Vallejo Charter was currently embroiled in a high-stakes standoff. Rumors were swirling that the ATF had flipped an informant inside their inner circle. Tensions within the club were at a boiling point. Paranoia was the new currency. The chapter president, a ruthless man named Big Al Rossi, had put the entire club on lockdown. Nobody trusted anybody. Assuming the note was just garbage blown into the box, or a foolish prank by some local neighborhood kids daring each other to touch the Hells Angels property, Grinder didn't even bother unfolding it. He crumpled the paper in his massive fist and tossed it into the aluminum garbage can beside the garage. He had real problems to worry about. A piece of trash was the least of them. Wednesday arrived with a suffocating blanket of humidity. The tension within the club had only escalated overnight. Grinder had been up until dawn hosting an emergency church meeting, the mandatory, highly secretive gatherings of fully patched members. The air inside the house still reeked of stale beer, cheap cigars, and nervous sweat. At 3:15 p.m., Lily Harrison returned. This time she wasn't just scared, she was frantic. Her eyes were red-rimmed and she clutched a fresh piece of paper. She had watched Grinder toss her first warning away from her hiding spot behind the neighbor's overgrown hedges. She knew he hadn't read it. She knew he didn't understand the catastrophe that was quietly unspooling right under his nose. Lily crept up to the mailbox, her breathing shallow. She shoved the second note into the box, pushing it as far back as her little arm could reach, praying he would take it seriously this time. Just as she pulled her hand away, the heavy oak front door of Grinder's house swung open. "Hey!" a gruff voice barked. It wasn't Grinder. It was Dutch Miller, the chapter's volatile enforcer, stepping out onto the porch to spit a stream of tobacco juice. Dutch was a mountain of a man, with a thick, unkempt beard and a violent reputation that extended from Oakland all the way down to the San Bernardino-Burdu charters. Lily froze for a fraction of a second, letting out a sharp squeak of terror before bolting down the street. Dutch chuckled, shaking his head. "Damn neighborhood rats," he muttered as Grinder walked up behind him, wiping engine grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "What's out there?" Grinder asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just some kid messing around your property," Dutch replied, adjusting the heavy leather cut over his shoulders. "Probably daring each other to steal your mail." Grinder grunted in annoyance. He walked down to the box. Inside, he found the second piece of folded notebook paper. This time, the word "urgent" was written on the outside, heavily underlined, the pencil pressing so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. Grinder stared at it. The paranoia that had been cultivated over decades of outlaw life began to prickle at the back of his neck. In his world, nothing was a coincidence. Rivals like the Mongols of the Vagos were known for using unconventional methods to send messages, scout properties, or map out hits. Was this a cartel warning, a scout marking his house? He unfolded the note halfway, seeing the messy, childish scrawl inside. "Just kids," he told himself, exhaling a frustrated breath. "Just stupid kids playing stupid games." His phone buzzed violently in his pocket. It was a text from Big Al. "Fegs are moving. Lay low. Sweep the bikes." The urgency of the club's survival instantly eclipsed the childish note in his hand. Grinder shoved the half-opened paper into the back pocket of his greasy denim jeans, completely forgetting about it the moment he turned back toward his garage to tear his Harley apart, looking for tracking devices. By Thursday, the weather had broken. The oppressive heat gave way to a violent torrential downpour that turned the Vallejo streets into running rivers of mud and motor oil. The sky was a bruised, angry purple. Inside the house, the atmosphere was just as dark. Grinder hadn't slept in over 48 hours. He and Dutch had stripped 3 motorcycles down to the chassis, checking every wire and hollow tube for FBI bugs. They had found nothing, but the absence of evidence only fueled their deep-seated paranoia. If the feds weren't tracking the bikes, they were watching the house. If they weren't watching the house, there was a rat breathing their air, eating their food, sitting at their table. At 4 p.m., the rain was coming down in sheets. Lily Harrison was soaked to the bone. Her thin sneakers squelched in the puddles as she marched down the street. Her frayed pink backpack offered no protection against the storm. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue, but her face was set in a mask of pure, desperate determination. She knew what was going to happen tonight. She had heard them talking in her living room. The men with the heavy boots. The men who had locked her mother in the basement. She knew they were waiting for the cover of darkness. Lily reached the rusted mailbox. Her hands were numb from the cold. She pulled a Ziploc bag from her backpack. Inside the plastic bag was the third note. She had written it in bright red marker this time, hoping the violent color would finally force the terrifying biker to pay attention. She opened the mailbox, slid the plastic bag inside, and slammed the metal door shut. The metallic siang echoed loudly through the rain. Inside the garage, Grinder's head snapped up. He had his .25 caliber 1911 pistol laid out on the workbench, running an oiled cloth over the barrel. His nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Every shadow looked like a tactical raid team, every sound like a battering ram. He snatched the gun, chambered around with a sharp metallic clack, and stalked toward the front door. He peered through the peephole, but the rain was too heavy to see anything clearly. Cursing under his breath, Grinder tucked the pistol into the waistband of his jeans at the small of his back, threw open the door, and stepped out into the deluge. The street was utterly empty. The only movement was the heavy rain bouncing off the asphalt. Grinder walked to the mailbox, water instantly soaking through his dark t-shirt. He yanked the door open. There, sitting starkly against the rusted bottom, was the Ziploc bag. The bright red ink bled through the paper, distorted by the plastic but clearly visible. Grinder snatched it out of the box. His jaw tightened in pure fury. He was a sergeant-at-arms for the Hells Angels. He had survived stabbings, highway shootouts, and federal indictments. He was not going to be intimidated by someone playing games with his mailbox. He didn't open the bag. Instead, he shoved it into the deep interior pocket of his heavy leather club vest, intending to bring it to church and have the club's intelligence guy, a tech-savvy member named Cypher, run the bag for prints. Someone was mocking him. Someone was probing his defenses. When Grinder found out who it was, he was going to break them in half. He marched back into the house, locking 3 deadbolts behind him. Friday morning, day 4. The storm had passed, leaving a bright, glaring sunrise in its wake. The house was quiet. Dutch had left around midnight to report back to Big Al. Grinder was finally alone. He sat at his cramped kitchen table, a steaming mug of black bitter coffee in his hands. Exhaustion pulled at the bags under his eyes. The adrenaline of the past 3 days was crashing, leaving him feeling hollowed out and older than his 48 years. He stood up to gather his laundry. He picked up his heavy leather coat from the back of the dining chair. As he hoisted the 20-pound vest, he felt a crinkle of plastic in the inner pocket. Grinder paused. He reached inside and pulled out the Ziploc bag from yesterday. The 3rd note. He stared at it for a long moment. The anger had burned out of him, replaced by a strange, creeping sense of dread. He set his coffee down. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his tactical folding knife. He sliced the top of the plastic bag open and carefully slid the piece of wide-ruled notebook paper out onto the wooden table. As he looked down at the bright red marker, a memory sparked. The 2nd note. Grinder walked over to the pair of greasy jeans he had thrown in the corner 2 days ago. He dug his hand into the back pocket and pulled out the crumpled 2nd note. He walked to the garbage can by the back door, dug through the dry paper waste at the top, and miraculously retrieved the first crumpled ball of paper he had discarded on Tuesday. He returned to the kitchen table. He flattened the 1st note. He flattened the 2nd note. Then he looked at the 3rd note, the one written in red. For the first time in 3 days, Thomas Grinder Hayes actually read the words. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's letters awkwardly sized, some written backward, the spelling entirely phonetic, but the message was brutally, undeniably clear. The 1st note read, Mr. Biker, the men with star badges are bad. They are at my house. The 2nd note read, Mr. Biker, you are gent. My stepdad is crying. The men said they will kill my mom if he doesn't do the job. Grinder's breath caught in his throat. His blood ran instantly cold, a physical chill washing over his heavily tattooed arms. He looked down at the final note, the red ink glaring up at him under the harsh kitchen lights. The 3rd note read, Mr. Biker, the men with star badges are fake cops. They are a rival club. I saw their tattoos. It is a snake. They made my stepdad put a bomb under your porch last night. Please don't start your motorcycle. Please save my mum. Grinder stopped breathing. A snake tattoo. The Vagos Motorcycle Club, the Green Nation. Bitter, blood-sworn rivals of the Hells Angels. And they had been under his house. Grinder slowly, meticulously lowered his eyes to the floorboards beneath his heavy combat boots. Right directly beneath the kitchen where he was sitting was the crawl space, and directly adjacent to the kitchen wall, separated by only an inch of drywall and a few studs, was his garage, where his Harley-Davidson was parked, where he had spent the last 2 days heavily scrubbing and aggressively stomping around. Please don't start your motorcycle. The little girl hadn't been playing a game. She hadn't been a scout for the feds. She was a hostage. She was collateral damage in a biker war she couldn't possibly understand, risking her life to stop an assassination. Grinder slowly stood up from the table, not making a sound, moving with the terrifying, calculated precision of a predator that has just realized it walked into a trap. He didn't reach for his keys. He didn't reach for the front door. He reached for his phone, and he reached for his gun. Day 4 had arrived, and the war had already begun. Grinder did not panic. Panic was a luxury dead men afforded themselves in their final seconds. Instead, decades of outlaw survival instincts took the wheel. He backed out of the kitchen with agonizing slowness, placing his boots exactly where he had stepped previously, hyper-aware of the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. He slipped out the back door and moved halfway across the muddy lawn before pulling out his encrypted burner phone. He hit a single speed dial number. "Yay!" Big Al Rossi's voice rasped on the other end, thick with sleep. "Al, it's Grinder. I need Breaker at my place. Now, no bikes, no noise. Bring him in through the back alley." "Feds?" Al asked, the sleep instantly vanishing from his tone. "Worse, Green Nation. They wired my house." 30 minutes later, a rusted plumbing van rolled silently to a stop behind Grinder's back fence. Out stepped Big Al Dutch and a wiry, scarred man named Breaker. Breaker was the Vallejo Charters demolitions and tech expert, an ex-combat engineer who had traded a military uniform for the red and white. Grinder met them at the fence, handing Big Al the 3 pieces of wide-ruled notebook paper. The club president, a massive man with a face like a worn catcher's mitt, read the childish scrawl in silence. His jaw tightened. "A 7-year-old girl dropped these off," Grinder said, his voice low and dangerous. "She lives 3 blocks down on Elm. They got her mother hostage, forced her stepdad to crawl under my porch last night." Breaker didn't wait for orders. He grabbed a flashlight, a set of mirrors, and a canvas tool bag, sliding on his belly into the dark, damp crawl space beneath Grinder's kitchen. The mud, the first thing she truly noticed in truling eternity. Grinder, Dutch, and Al stood in the muddy grass, hands hovering near the heavy pistols tucked into their waistbands, eyes scanning the perimeter. Finally, Breaker slithered backward out of the darkness. He was covered in mud and spider webs, but his hands held a pair of clipped wires. He looked up at Grinder, his face entirely devoid of color. "They packed 3 pipe bombs with nails and ball bearings wired to a commercial blasting cap," Breaker whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "They spliced the trigger directly into the remote receiver of your garage door. The second you hit the clicker to rotor bike out, or the second you hit the ignition switch near that wall, the whole foundation would have vaporized. You wouldn't have known what hit you." Dutch let out a string of vicious curses, spitting tobacco juice into the grass. The Vagos, they didn't want to risk a direct drive-by and start a street war with the cops watching, so they outsourced the hit to a terrified civilian. Big Al looked down at the notes in his massive hand. The bright red letters spelling, "Please save my mom," seemed to burn in the morning light. The Hells Angels were outlaws. They sold contraband, they fought violently for their territory, and they lived entirely outside the law. But they had a code. You did not involve children, and you did not terrorize innocent mothers to get to a patched member. 3 blocks down, you said? Big Al asked, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a terrifying dead calm. "Yeah," Grinder replied, racking the slide of his .45 caliber 1911. The metallic clack echoed like a judge's gavel in the quiet backyard. "Let's go to church." The dark sedan was still parked in the driveway of the small, peeling blue house on Elm Street. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. 3 men wearing tactical vests over green t-shirts, the signature color of the Vagos Motorcycle Club, lounged in the living room. Fake police badges hung around their necks, a ruse used to gain entry the night before. In the corner of the room, Lily's mother, Sarah, sat tied to a dining chair, her face bruised and tear-streaked. Her husband, Arthur, was curled on the floor nursing broken ribs. Little Lily was locked in the bathroom down the hall, trembling in the bathtub. The Vago leader, a heavily tattooed man named Rattlesnake, checked his watch. "You should have started that Harley by now," he muttered to his accomplices. "Go check the police scanner. See if Vallejo PD is reporting an explosion." Before the man could move, the front door of the house exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and twisted hinges. Dutch came through the threshold like a runaway freight train, leveling a 12-gauge shotgun. Big Al followed, blocking the exit. But it was Grinder who moved with the speed and ferocity of a starved wolf. Rattlesnake reached for the pistol on the coffee table, but Grinder was already on him. The Hell's Angel drove his heavy combat boot into Rattlesnake's chest, sending the Vago crashing through the glass table. The 2 other fake cops froze, staring down the barrel of Dutch's shotgun and the cold, unblinking eyes of Big Al Rossi. "Don't even twitch," Dutch growled, the hammer of the shotgun clicking back. Grinder hauled Rattlesnake off the floor by his throat, slamming him against the drywall so hard the framed family photos rattled off their nails. Grinder pressed the hot barrel of his 1911 directly under Rattlesnake's chin. "You lost something under my house," Grinder whispered, his eyes entirely black with rage. The Vago leader swallowed hard, realizing instantly that the meticulously planned assassination had backfired. The room fell into a heavy, terrifying silence, broken only by the muffled sobs of Sarah tied to the chair. Big Al pulled a hunting knife from his belt and quickly sliced her bindings, helping her up. Grinder looked down at Arthur, the stepdad, bleeding on the carpet. "Why you?" Grinder demanded, not taking his gun off Rattlesnake. "Why did they pick your house?" "Nah, Arthur coughed, spitting blood onto the carpet. A heavy twist of guilt washed over his face. I used to run with them," Arthur confessed, his voice shaking. 10 years ago, in Reno, I skimmed from their transport. I changed my name, moved here, tried to start a family. I thought I was a ghost, but they found me. They told me if I didn't plant the bomb under your house, they would kill Sarah and Lily and make it look like a murder-suicide." Grinder's jaw clenched. The pieces fell into place. The Vagos weren't just taking out a rival Hell's Angel. They were tying up a loose end, using a traitor to do their dirty work, so the Green Nation's hands looked clean. It was cowardly, and it almost worked. "Where is the kid?" Grinder barked. "Bathroom," Sarah cried, running down the hall. She unlocked the door, pulling a terrified, weeping Lily into her arms. Grinder handed Rattlesnake over to Dutch. "Take these 3 to the warehouse by the docks," Grinder ordered, his voice devoid of any mercy. "Cipher 'em, the boys will want to have a long conversation with them about club boundaries." Dutch grinned, shoving Rattlesnake toward the back door. The fate of the 3 Vagos was sealed the moment they stepped foot in Vallejo. Grinder walked over to the hallway. He holstered his weapon and knelt, his massive, imposing frame dropping down to eye level with the little girl. Lily was shaking, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. She peeped out, her wide eyes locking onto the giant tattooed biker she had been so afraid of just yesterday. Grinder reached into his pocket. He pulled out the 3 pieces of wide-ruled notebook paper. "You wrote these?" he asked gently, his gruff voice softening to a rumble. Lily slowly nodded. "You're a brave kid," Grinder said, pulling a small silver skull ring off his pinky finger. He held it out to her. "You saved my life, Lily. And in my club, Debts are paid in full. Nobody is ever going to hurt your family again. You have my word. You have the word of the Vallejo Charter." Lily hesitated, then reached out with a tiny hand and took the heavy silver ring. Within an hour, the Hells Angels had scrubbed the house of any evidence of the Vagos. Big Al handed Arthur an envelope stuffed with $20,000 in untraceable cash. It was relocation money. The Angels escorted the family's packed station wagon out of the city limits, ensuring they had safe passage to a new life, far away from the ghosts of Arthur's past. Grinder stood on his porch later that evening, watching the sunset bleed over the Vallejo skyline. The rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway stood empty. He lit a cigarette, taking a long drag. The world of an outlaw was built on violence, paranoia, and brotherhood. But as he looked down at the empty space on his pinky finger, Thomas Hayes knew that sometimes the greatest loyalty didn't come from a man wearing a three-piece patch. Sometimes it came from a 7-year-old girl with a pencil and the courage to knock on the devil's door. Did this intense story of unexpected bravery keep you on the edge of your seat? Sometimes heroes come in the smallest sizes and justice arrives on two wheels. If you love this real-life biker drama, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time. The jukebox cut out mid-song. Glasses stopped blinking. 50 heavily armed bikers turned their heads as a 6'4" Hells Angel named Bull stared down at a terrified 10-year-old boy. The giant biker pointed a calloused, shaking finger at the silver pendant on the boy's neck. "Where did you get that?" It was a scorching Thursday afternoon in July 2004, the kind of Mojave Desert heat that distorted the horizon into wavy, watery mirages. The Copperhead Saloon sat just off a battered stretch of Route 66 near Needles, California, a windowless canna-block dive bar that smelled perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and decades of cigarette smoke. It was a local sanctuary, a place where people went when they didn't want to be found. Behind the scratched mahogany bar stood Maggie, a tough-as-nails woman in her late 40s who had seen just about every flavor of trouble the desert had to offer. Tucked away in the darkest corner booth, nursing a melting cherry cola, was her 10-year-old nephew, Leo. Leo was a quiet kid, small for his age, with a shock of messy brown hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room. He had been staying with Maggie for the past 3 months following the sudden death of his father. To pass the time, Leo usually sat in that exact booth, sketching in a battered spiral notebook. At exactly 3:15 p.m., a low, guttural rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards of the Copperhead. It started as a distant thunder, but quickly escalated into an ear-splitting roar. Maggie's hands froze on the pint glass she was polishing. The 3 regulars sitting at the bar immediately cashed out, leaving crumpled bills on the counter before scurrying out the back door. They knew the sound. A pack of Hells Angels was pulling into the gravel parking lot. Through the propped-open front door, Maggie watched as 24 custom Harley-Davidsons kicked up a massive cloud of dust. These weren't weekend riders. This was the San Bernardino chapter. They rode in tight formation, their leather cuts baking in the 110-degree sun. Leading the pack was Jackson Riley, known on the street simply as Bull. He was a towering mountain of a man, standing 6'4" and weighing north of 280 pounds. His forearms were covered in faded prison ink, and a jagged scar ran from his left earlobe down to his collarbone. Bull was the sergeant-at-arms, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him across state lines. Flanking him were 2 equally imposing enforcers, guys known in the local files as Dutch, Miller, and Snake Henderson. The heavy wooden front door swung wide and the daylight poured in, framing the bikers in silhouette. As they stepped into the dimly lit saloon, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of hot engine oil, sweat, and worn leather. Maggie swallowed hard. She gave Leo a sharp, silent look from across the room. "Keep your head down and stay invisible." Leo shrank back into the cracked red vinyl of the booth, pulling his knees up to his chest. "Afternoon, Maggie," Bull said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried over the twang of the country song playing on the jukebox. "Bull," Maggie nodded, keeping her voice steady. "What can I get you boys? The usual?" "Yeah, pitchers of Coors." "Keep 'em coming until we say stop," Bull commanded, leaning his massive frame against the bar. The rest of the chapter fanned out, claiming the pool tables, the dartboards, and the prime booths. They were loud, boisterous, and entirely in control of the room. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. Maggie poured beer, the bikers laughed, and Leo remained completely unnoticed in his dark corner. But the heat and the boredom were getting to the young boy. His pencil snapped against the paper of his notebook. Frustrated, he reached under the collar of his faded t-shirt to pull out the only thing he had left of his father, a heavy, custom-made silver necklace. It wasn't a standard piece of jewelry. It hung on a thick steel chain, a massive, solid silver pendant that caught the neon glow of the Budweiser sign hanging over the bar. Leo absent-mindedly rolled the heavy metal between his small fingers, feeling the familiar grooves and jagged edges of the design. Bull Riley, having just finished his second pint, pushed off the bar and began walking toward the restrooms at the back of the saloon. His heavy boots thudded against the hardwood floor as he passed the shadowy alcove where Leo was sitting. A flash of reflected neon light caught his eye. Bull stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his massive head, his eyes locking onto the small boy in the booth. More specifically, his eyes locked onto the silver object dangling from the boy's hands. The sergeant-at-arms didn't move. He didn't breathe. The color literally drained from his sun-leathered face. For a man who had survived bar brawls, prison riots, and high-speed chases, he suddenly looked as though he had just seen a ghost. "Dutch," Bull snapped, his voice tight and dangerously low. Dutch Miller, who was chalking a pool cue nearby, looked up. "Yeah, Bull, kill the jukebox." Now, Dutch didn't ask questions. He walked over and ripped the cord right out of the wall. The sudden, deafening silence in the bar was terrifying. Every biker in the room stopped talking. Pool balls stopped rolling. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward their sergeant-at-arms, waiting for a command. Bull slowly approached the booth. He loomed over the table, casting a massive shadow over the trembling 10-year-old. He reached out a massive, scarred hand and pointed a calloused, shaking finger directly at the boy's chest. "Where did you get that?" The silence in the Copperhead saloon was so absolute you could hear the hum of the refrigerator compressor behind the bar. Maggie's heart dropped into her stomach. She dropped her bar towel and practically vaulted over the counter, rushing toward the booth. "Bull! Hey, Bull, back off!" "He's just a kid. He's my nephew. He doesn't know anything." Bull didn't even look at her. He just raised his left arm, holding it out like an iron gate to block Maddie from coming any closer. "I ain't gonna hurt him, Maggie," Bull said, his voice trembling with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly close to grief. "But I need to see that necklace. Right now." Leo was paralyzed. His wide, terrified eyes darted from the giant biker to his aunt. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he lifted the heavy silver chain over his head and placed the pendant on the scarred wooden table. Bull reached down and picked it up. It looked tiny in his massive palm. It was a custom-forged piece of silver, heavy and tarnished. It was shaped like a winged skull, clenching a broken motorcycle piston in its teeth. But what made it entirely unique was the right eye socket of the skull. It was set with a chipped, blood-red ruby, and the left wing had a distinct, jagged crack running through the silver, a flaw in the original casting that was never fixed. Every patched member of the San Bernardino chapter crowding around the booth instantly recognized it. Dutch Miller let out a low whistle. Snake Henderson took a step back, pulling his sunglasses off his face. It was the president's pendant. Specifically, it belonged to Iron John Riley. Bull's older brother, the founding president of their chapter. 15 years ago, in the winter of 1989, Iron John had vanished off the face of the earth. He had ridden out into the Mojave Desert one night to meet with a rival syndicate, and simply never returned. The club had spent months tearing the desert apart, searching every canyon and abandoned mineshaft. They found nothing. No body, no bike, no clues. The assumption was that the rival club had ambushed him, murdered him, and buried him deep. That assumption had sparked a brutal, bloody war that lasted for 3 years and cost the Hells Angels dearly. Through it all, the one thing Bull had always sworn to find was that silver pendant. Iron John had worn it every day of his life. He would never have taken it off voluntarily. It was a symbol of the chapter's bloodline. And now, a decade and a half later, it had just been pulled from beneath the t-shirt of a 10-year-old boy in a roadside dive bar. Bull's massive chest heaved as he stared at the silver skull. He gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white, the sharp edges digging into his palm. When he finally looked back down at Leo, his eyes were bloodshot and burning with a terrifying intensity. "Boy," Bull said, leaning down so his face was only inches from Leo's, "I'm gonna ask you one more time. And you need to tell me the absolute truth, or God help me, I will tear this bar down to the foundation. Where did you get this?" Leo swallowed hard, tears welling up in his eyes. He looked at Maggie, who gave him a terrified nod to answer the man. "My dad," Leo squeaked out, his voice cracking. "My dad gave it to me." Bull frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. "Your dad? Did he buy it? Did he find it in the dirt? Who the hell is your dad?" "That Tobe Amando." "He didn't find it," Leo whispered, wiping his nose. "He said it was a reminder. He gave it to me right before he got sick, before he died 3 months ago." "What was his name, kid?" Dutch Miller barked from behind Bull, stepping forward. "Give us a name." "Arthur," Leo said, shrinking back. "Arthur Pendleton." The name hit the room like a bomb. If the bar had been quiet before, it was now completely devoid of oxygen. Bull stumbled back half a step, hitting the edge of the adjacent booth. Snake Henderson let out a string of vicious curses, pacing furiously in a tight circle. "Arthur Pendleton." Maggie gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth. She knew the name, of course it was her brother-in-law, Leo's father. But she had no idea what that name meant to the men standing in her bar. To the Hells Angels, Arthur Pendleton wasn't just some random civilian. In 1989, Arthur Pendleton had been the chapter's bookkeeper. He was a quiet, nervous accountant who handled the club's legitimate businesses, the auto shops, the real estate, the bar revenues. And on the exact same night that Iron John Riley disappeared into the desert, Arthur Pendleton had also vanished without a trace. But Arthur hadn't left empty-handed. When the club kicked down the door to the accountant's office the following morning, the safe was blown wide open. Over $500,000 in unlaundered cash, the club's entire war chest, was gone. For 15 years, the official club narrative was that the rival syndicate had killed Iron John, and a terrified Arthur Pendleton had used the chaos to steal the money and run for his life. But looking at the silver pendant resting on the table, a horrifying new reality began to dawn on Bull Riley. Iron John's necklace. The accountant's son. Arthur had this? Bull stammered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, ragged whisper. He looked at the boy, really looking at him this time. The messy brown hair, the shape of his jaw. "He told me to guard it," Leo cried, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "He told me it was the most important thing he ever took. Please don't take it. It's all I have left of him." Bull slowly reached into his leather cut. The bikers behind him tensed, hands drifting instinctively toward their waistbands. But Bull didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a faded, dog-eared Polaroid photograph from 1988. He threw it onto the table in front of the boy. It was a picture of Iron John standing next to a younger, terrified-looking Arthur Pendleton. Did your father Bull started choking on the words as the pieces of a 15-year-old puzzle violently snapped together in his mind. Did your father ever tell you how he got sick, Leo? Leo looked down at the photograph, his small finger tracing the face of his late father. He didn't get sick like a cold, Leo said softly, wiping his eyes. He got sick because of the guilt. He told me the ghost of the man in the desert never let him sleep. And sorry, Kulaus. The ghost of the man in the desert, Bull repeated, the words sounding hollow and metallic as they scraped their way out of his throat. He stared at the terrified 10-year-old, his mind violently rejecting the reality of what he was hearing. Behind him, the bar erupted. "Arthur killed him!" Snake Henderson yelled, kicking a wooden bar stool so hard it shattered against the cinder block wall. "That rat bastard accountant shot John, took the club's money, and ran. I knew it. I told you 15 years ago, Bull." "Shut up, Snake," Bull growled, not taking his eyes off Leo. "Bull, he just admitted his old man took the necklace off John's corpse." Dutch Miller took a threatening step toward the booth, his hand dropping to the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "Let's take the kid out back. We'll find out exactly where his old man hid the money." I said, "Shut up." Bull's voice exploded like a shotgun blast in the confined space of the saloon. He whipped around, his massive frame blocking the booth entirely. He grabbed Dutch by the lapels of his leather cut and shoved him backward with such force that the enforcer crashed into a pool table, sending balls scattering across the green felt. "Nobody touches the boy," Bull snarled, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of authority and desperate grief. "Iron drawn was my blood. This is my call. Anyone else want to weigh in?" The room fell dead silent again. Dutch slowly picked himself up, rushing off his cut, and gave a stiff nod of submission, stake backed away, crossing his heavily tattooed arms. Bull turned back to the booth. His massive hands were trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. He looked down at Leo, who was now openly weeping, clinging to Maggie's arm. Maggie had positioned her body between the giant biker and her nephew, looking like a mother wolf ready to die for her pup. "Maggie," Bull said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "I swear on my brother's soul, I ain't gonna lay a finger on him. But I need to know everything Arthur told this boy. Every single word." Maggie swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the angry bikers and her nephew. She gently squeezed Leo's shoulder. "Leo, honey, you need to tell him. What else did your dad say about the necklace? About the man in the desert?" Leo wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheek. He looked at the heavy silver skull resting on the table. "He didn't say much," Leo whimpered. "He wouldn't talk about it out loud. He said the walls were listening. But when he drank, he wrote things down. He couldn't sleep. He said he had to get it out of his head." Bull's eyes narrowed. "He wrote it down? Where?" Leo reached over to the far side of the booth and pulled the battered spiral notebook he'd been sketching in toward him. Its cover was torn, covered in childish doodles of muscle cars and cartoon characters. But as Leo flipped it over, the spine was heavily taped, thick with extra pages shoved into the binding. "The back half," Leo whispered, pushing the notebook across the scarred wooden table toward Bull. "He gave it to me at the hospital. He said if anyone ever came looking for the silver skull, I had to give them this." Bull picked up the notebook. It looked absurdly small in his hands. He opened it to the middle, bypassing Leo's pencil sketches, and hit the pages where the handwriting changed. It was a stark, jarring transition. The neat, methodical handwriting of an accountant was entirely absent. Instead, the pages were covered in frantic, jagged scrawls, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. There were dates, rambling paragraphs of guilt, and Bible verses crossed out with heavy black ink. Bull's eyes tracked across the chaotic ink. October 14th. "The sand keeps shifting in my dreams. I can't wash the copper smell off my hands. He made me promise. He ordered me. But I am a coward. I am a coward who left the king in the dirt. Bull flipped the page, his breath hitched. Drawn across 2 full pages was a map. It wasn't a professional cartographer's map, but a highly detailed, localized sketch of a specific patch of the Mojave Desert. It showed the rusted-out husks of the old Iron Mountain pumping plant ruins. It showed a dry wash, a cluster of Joshua trees, and a specific rocky outcropping shaped like an anvil. Beneath the anvil rock, Arthur had drawn an X, and at the bottom of the page, written in large block letters, 34 degrees 08 N, 115 degrees 07 W. I buried the iron. I buried the gold. I kept the silver. Dutch, Bull said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Yeah, Bull? Get the pack ready. We're riding to Iron Mountain. Bull closed the notebook and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat. He looked down at Leah one last time, picking up the silver pendant from the table. He wrapped the heavy chain around his fist. If this is a lie, Bull said to Maggie, his voice cold and flat, there is nowhere on this earth you can run. I'm leaving 2 men at the door. You and the boy don't leave this bar until I get back. Within 3 minutes, the deafening roar of 24 Harley-Davidsons shook the foundations of the Copperhead Saloon. Maggie and Leo watched through the dusty front window as the pack tore out onto Route 66, leaving a massive plume of dust in their wake, heading straight into the unforgiving heart of the Mojave. It was well past midnight when the San Bernardino chapter arrived at the coordinates. The desert air had plummeted to a bitter chill, illuminated only by the harsh, sweeping beams of the motorcycle's headlights cutting through the darkness. They found the anvil rock exactly where Arthur's manic drawing had placed it. Bull dismounted in silence. He pulled a folding trench shovel from his saddlebag. He didn't ask for help. For the first 2 hours, the only sound in the vast, empty desert was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of Bull's shovel biting into the hard-packed dirt, mixed with his heavy, labored breathing. The rest of the chapter stood in a wide circle, smoking cigarettes in absolute silence, watching their sergeant-at-arms dig. At 3 feet deep, the shovel hit something that wasn't rock. It was a dull, hollow thud. Bull stopped. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, throwing the shovel aside, and began tearing at the earth with his bare, calloused hands. Dutch and Snake finally stepped forward, dropping to their knees to help him clear the dirt away. They unearthed a heavy, military-grade steel lockbox. It was heavily rusted but completely intact. "Is it the cash?" Snake whispered, shining a heavy maglite down into the hole. "Keep digging," Bull ordered, his voice cracking. He hadn't come for the money. 2 feet to the left of the lockbox, the dirt gave way to something softer. Canvas. Bull gently brushed the sand away, revealing the rotting remnants of a heavy canvas tarp. As he pulled the decaying fabric back, the beam of the flashlight illuminated faded black leather, a tarnished silver belt buckle, and the unmistakable white and red patch of the Hells Angels. It was Iron John. Bull collapsed backward, sitting in the dirt, his head dropping to his chest. A ragged, terrible sound escaped his throat, the sound of 15 years of agonizing uncertainty finally breaking. The men around him respectfully took a step back, taking off their sunglasses and bowing their heads. After a long moment, Bull wiped his face with his grimy hands and turned his attention to the steel lockbox. He grabbed the crowbar from Dutch and jammed it under the rusted hasp, leaning his massive weight onto the iron bar until the lock snapped with a sharp crack. Bull threw the lid open. Inside, stacked in neat, vacuum-sealed plastic bags, was the missing $500,000. Arthur Pendleton hadn't spent a single dime of it. Resting on top of the cash was a thick manila envelope wrapped in 3 layers of heavy plastic. Bull pulled it out, tearing through the plastic to retrieve a stack of yellowed papers. It was a letter dated the exact night of their disappearance in 1989. Bull stood up, walking toward the headlights of his bike. Dutch and the others gathered close as Bull read Arthur's final confession aloud into the freezing desert night. If you are reading this, Bull, it means the guilt finally killed me, and my boy gave you the map. I need you to know I didn't betray your brother. I loved him. He was the only one in the club who treated me like a man. Bull's voice caught. He cleared his throat and continued reading. That night, John and I were riding back from the bank in Barstow with the cash. We got ambushed on Route 66 by the Vipers. There were 10 of them. John told me to ride into the canyon and hide. He turned his bike around and took them all on by himself so I could get away. When the gunfire stopped, I crept back. John had killed 4 of them and run the rest off, but he was hit. Bad. Dutch cursed under his breath. Snake stared blankly into the dark. He was bleeding out in the dirt. Bull read, tears now freely streaming down his scarred face. I tried to get him on the bike, tried to take him to a hospital, but he refused. He knew the ATF was closing in on the chapter. He knew if he died in a hospital, the feds would confiscate the war chest. He ordered me to take the money and bury it. He told me to hide, to wait until the heat died down, and then return it to you so the club could survive. Bull's hands shook violently as he read the final lines. He gave me his silver pendant to prove to you that it was his order. Then he made me promise to bury him deep so the Vipers couldn't parade his body around. I buried my president in the dark. But I was so scared, Bull. I was a coward. I ran, and I changed my name, and I never had the courage to come back. I kept the money safe. But the ghost of the man in the desert never let me sleep. Forgive me. Bull slowly lowered the letter. For 15 years they had hunted Arthur Pendleton, believing him to be a traitor, a thief, and a murderer. In reality, Arthur was just a terrified accountant who had dutifully followed the final desperate orders of his dying president, living in solitary torment to protect the club's future. Bull looked down at his brother's grave. He finally knew the truth. Iron John hadn't been murdered in a cowardly double-cross. He had gone down like a king, fighting off 10 men to protect his club. The sun was just beginning to crest over the jagged peaks of the Mojave when the roar of the motorcycles returned to the Copperhead Saloon. Inside, Maggie and Leo were sitting in the exact same booth. They hadn't slept. When the heavy wooden door swung open and Bull walked in, covered in desert dirt and sweat, Maggie instinctively pulled Leo behind her. Bull didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked 15 years older, but somehow lighter. He walked slowly over to the booth. He didn't say a word to Maggie. He just looked down at the 10-year-old boy. Bull reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver skull with the chipped ruby eye. He held it out. Leo hesitated, then slowly reached out his small hand. Bull dropped the heavy pendant into the boy's palm. Your father wasn't a thief, Leo, Bull said, his deep voice thick with emotion. And he wasn't a murderer. He was a man who was given a burden too heavy to carry. But he protected my brother's legacy. He kept his secret safe. Bull placed his massive, calloused hand gently on top of Leo's head. You wear that silver proud, kid. And if anyone ever asks you where you got it, you tell them Arthur Pendleton gave it to you. And you tell them the San Bernardino chapter said nobody gets to touch it. Bull turned and walked out of the bar, the morning light framing his massive silhouette as the jukebox finally clicked back on, playing a soft, familiar tune into the dusty air. The truth can hide in the darkest corners for decades, only to be brought into the light by the most unexpected hands. Arthur Pendleton carried a crushing secret to his grave, but his son's innocence finally set 2 tormented souls free. If this gripping story of loyalty, misunderstanding, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. The ground shook before we even saw them. Over 50 Harleys, gleaming chrome and roaring engines, surrounded Oak Ridge Middle School. Teachers panicked, locking doors. The Hells Angels had arrived, but they weren't there to start a riot. They were looking for one specific teacher. And what happened next shocked everyone. Sarah Jenkins loved her job, but she despised the politics of Oak Ridge Middle School, nestled in a wealthy suburb of Riverside, California. The school was a pristine institution where the parking lot was filled with luxury SUVs and the PTA meetings felt like corporate boardrooms. Sarah, a 28-year-old English teacher with a penchant for championing the underdogs, often felt like an outsider among the elite faculty. But no one was more of an outsider than 8-year-old Tommy Miller. Tommy didn't wear designer polo shirts or expensive sneakers. He came to school in scuffed combat boots, faded jeans, and an oversized denim vest that looked like it had seen decades of highway wind. He was a quiet, observant boy who sat in the back row of Sarah's homeroom, always finishing his reading assignments early, but rarely speaking a word. The other children gave him a wide berth, whispering rumors they had heard from their parents. The rumors were true, of course. Tommy's father was Big Dave Miller, a known, fully patched member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club. Dave was a towering man with a thick beard, tattooed arms, and a terrifying scowl. When he dropped Tommy off in the mornings on his roaring Harley-Davidson, the crossing guards would literally take a step back. Despite his father's intimidating reputation, Tommy was a gentle kid. He drew incredibly detailed sketches of birds and possessed a politeness that was entirely absent in the spoiled children of Oak Ridge's elite. Unfortunately, in a school where pedigree mattered more than character, Tommy had a target on his back from day one. The primary archer was Chad Henderson. Chad was the golden child of Arthur Henderson, a prominent local real estate developer and the president of the school board. Chad had learned early on that his family's money bought him immunity. He tormented the poorer kids, disrupted classes, and always played the victim when caught. Principal Richard Sterling, a man whose spine seemed entirely composed of PTA donations, never disciplined Chad. The tension finally snapped on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in October. Sarah was grading papers at a picnic bench during recess when she heard the shouting. She dropped her red pen and sprinted toward the edge of the playground. A crowd of children had formed a circle near the chain-link fence, pushing her way through the chanting kids. Sarah found Tommy pinned against the fence by Chad and two of his cronies. Chad was dangling something just out of Tommy's reach, a small, silver pocket watch. Sarah knew that watch. Tommy had brought it in for show and tell weeks ago. It had belonged to his late mother, one of the few physical memories he had of her before she passed away from cancer. "Give it back, Chad," Tommy demanded, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with a restrained, desperate anger. His fists were balled at his sides. "What are you going to do about it? Biker trash," Chad sneered, tossing the watch up and catching it. "Gonna get your daddy's little gang to beat me up. I said give it back." Tommy lunged forward. He didn't throw a punch. He merely reached for the watch. But Chad, realizing he was losing his audience, took a dramatic step backward, intentionally tripped over a tree root, and fell hard onto the asphalt. The watch slipped from his fingers, hitting a rock with a sickening crack. The glass face shattered. Chad immediately grabbed his knee and began to wail. "He pushed me, mister! Sterling! He pushed me!" Before Sarah could even reach them, Principal Sterling was already marching across the blacktop, his face flushed with indignation. He didn't look at the shattered watch on the ground. He didn't look at Tommy's devastated, tear-streaked face. He only saw Arthur Henderson's son clutching his knee. "Thomas Miller," Sterling bellowed. "My office, right this second." "Wait, Richard, that's not what happened," Sarah interjected, stepping between the principal and the boy. "Chad stole Tommy's property. Tommy didn't push him. Chad tripped. Sterling shot Sarah a warning glare. Miss Jenkins, I do not need your input on disciplinary matters. Look at Chad's knee. This boy is a menace. It's exactly what I warned the district about when we let his kind enroll here. Sarah felt a hot flash of pure rage. His kind, she echoed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. My office. Miss Jenkins. You too, since you seem to want to be his lawyer. 10 minutes later, the atmosphere in the principal's office was suffocating. Tommy sat in an oversized leather chair, staring blankly at the shattered pieces of his mother's watch in his palms. He wasn't crying anymore. He just looked incredibly small and defeated. Principal Sterling sat behind his massive mahogany desk, already drafting an expulsion recommendation. He had completely bypassed a suspension. This is a zero-tolerance school. Thomas, Sterling said, adjusting his glasses. We do not tolerate violence. We do not tolerate gang behavior. He's 8 years old. Richard Mott. Sarah slammed her hands down on the desk, startling both the principal and the boy. He is an 8-year-old child who was being bullied. Chad Henderson cornered him, stole a precious family heirloom, and broke it. I saw the entire thing. If you try to expel Tommy for this, I will formally dispute it. Sterling leaned back, interlacing his fingers. Sarah, you are a bright young teacher. You have a long career ahead of you. Do not throw it away over a lost cause. Mr. Henderson is fully aware of the incident Chad called him from the nurse's office. Arthur is demanding Tommy's immediate expulsion. And frankly, I agree. The boy is a liability. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Sarah looked down at Tommy. The boy refused to look up, assuming the adults would do what adults always did to him, throw him away. I won't let you do this, Sarah said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. If you process that expulsion, I am going to the superintendent, and if he doesn't listen, I will go to the Riverside Tribune. I will tell them exactly how Oak Ridge protects the bullies of wealthy donors while punishing the victims. Sterling's face turned an ugly shade of purple. You are bordering on insubordination, Miss Jenkins. I don't care, Sarah shot back. Call Dave Miller. Call his father right now. Tell him what happened to his son's watch. Sterling scoffed. I am not inviting a criminal into my office. Then I will, Sarah said. She grabbed the emergency contact file off Sterling's desk before he could stop her. She dialed Dave Miller's number on her cell phone, right there in the office, when the gruff, deep voice answered. Sarah didn't flinch. Mr. Miller, this is Sarah Jenkins, Tommy's teacher. There has been an incident at school. She explained everything: Chad's bullying, the broken watch, and Sterling's attempt to expel Tommy to protect a donor's son. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. So long. Sarah thought the call had dropped. Finally, Dave Miller spoke. His voice was terrifyingly calm. Keep my boy with you. Miss Jenkins, don't let that principal near him. I'll be there tomorrow morning. The line went dead. That night, Sarah barely slept. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest. She had blatantly defied the most powerful man in the school and threatened to expose the school board president. In the highly political environment of Oak Ridge, she had basically signed her own resignation letter. Worse, she wasn't sure what Dave Miller was planning. I'll be there tomorrow morning. The words echoed in her head. Had she just incited a violent confrontation, Dave was a hell's angel. Men in his circle didn't settle disputes with strongly worded emails and PTA mediation. They lived by their own code of loyalty and retaliation. She arrived at Oak Ridge Elementary early the next morning.
the sky still a bruised purple before the dawn. The school felt eerily quiet. When she checked her inbox in the staff lounge, she found a formal email from Principal Sterling effective immediately. You are placed on administrative warning pending a review of your professional conduct. She printed the email, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. By 8 a.m., the school was buzzing with its usual chaotic energy. Minivans and Mercedes-Benz SUVs clogged the drop-off lane. Arthur Henderson himself had arrived, strutting into the main office in a tailored suit, a smug smile plastered across his face. He was there to finalize Tommy's expulsion. Tommy hadn't shown up. His desk at the back of Sarah's homeroom sat empty. Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Had Dave Miller decided it wasn't worth the fight? Had he just pulled Tommy out of the school to avoid the drama? First period began. Sarah tried to guide her class through a reading comprehension exercise, but her eyes kept darting to the window. At 8:45 a.m., it started. It didn't begin as a sound, but as a vibration. The coffee in Sarah's mug began to ripple. Then, a low, guttural rumbling echoed through the valley, growing steadily louder until it sounded like a fleet of low-flying bombers was approaching the school. The kids in Sarah's class stopped reading. "What is that?" one little girl asked, her eyes wide. Sarah walked to the window and pulled up the blinds. Her breath caught in her throat. Turning off the main boulevard and pulling into the long, circular driveway of Oak Ridge Middle School was a massive column of motorcycles. It wasn't just Dave Miller. It was a terrifyingly precise, organized formation of heavy iron and leather. There were at least 50 of them, huge, bearded men wearing black leather cuts adorned with the infamous winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels. They rode two abreast, their engines roaring in a deafening, synchronized symphony that rattled the school's windows. The sheer presence of them was overwhelming. They bypassed the visitor parking lot entirely.